So the idea of fundamentalism would have been just completely an anachronism to the founders. I mean, there were certainly conservative forms of Christianity, but fundamentalism as we know it today, not something they would have done. The fourth point. How did conservative Christians react to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights at that time, when those documents were adopted or shortly thereafter? And that's where things really get interesting, because what you find when you do research in this area is you find conservative ministers attacking the Constitution and attacking the Bill of Rights. Why did they attack it? Because it did not specifically state that we were a Christian nation. There was a minister. His name was John Mason. He was a pastor of a New York church. He gave a famous sermon in 1793. So this is just a couple of years after the adoption of the Bill of Rights. He's saying, "The omission of God in the Constitution is an omission which no pretext whatever can palliate. It will overturn us from the foundations of the fabric we have been rearing and crush us to atoms in a wreck." Crush us to atoms. Like Pat Robertson of his day, you know? Pat Robertson's always sending a hurricane up to smote his enemies and things like that. Maybe a meteor if you can send one up. Here's this guy kind of saying, well, we didn't recognize Christianity or Jesus or God in our Constitution, and he is going to wreck us. He's going to bring divine punishment upon us. And he wasn't the only one saying that. 1811, Reverend Samuel Austin gives a famous speech to his congregation in which he writes, "Our Constitution is entirely disconnected from Christianity. This is a capital defect which will inevitably lead to its destruction." Now, if we had been a Christian nation, if that had been the intent of the founders, if that had been stated partly, these ministers would not have been giving sermons like this. They looked at that as a fault. Now, this continued well into the 19th century. In fact, we got to the point, around the time of the Civil War, a band of ministers became convinced that because we had not officially declared ourselves a Christian nation, that God was punishing us with a civil war. Remember what these ministers were saying back in the early period. God was going to bring vengeance upon us because we had not declared ourselves officially Christian. That punishment, according to these ministers, was the Civil War. They formed an organization. They formed a lobbying group called the National Reform Association. The National Reform Association had a couple of goals. One was to get some type of recognition of God on our money. Another was passage of some kind of a national bill to mandate Sunday be a day of rest. And the third, most interestingly, was rewrite the preamble to the Constitution to explicitly recognize Jesus Christ and Christianity. Let me read you, if I have it. I don't think I do. But essentially, they had this new preamble that recognized Jesus Christ, Christianity, and God. And they put this up for a vote in the Congress several times. It never really got, obviously, passed because it's not part of our Constitution today. But my point is, if we had already been a Christian nation, they would not have been advocating for this at the time of the Civil War and shortly thereafter. A couple other things that happened around this time. In God we trust. I mentioned a moment ago one of their goals was to get some type of recognition of God on currency. That, again, is a post-Civil War, or a Civil War manifestation of what scholars now call civil religion. There was a minister in Pennsylvania, and he was one of these ministers who was convinced God was punishing us because we had not recognized him for Christianity in the Constitution. So he wrote to the Secretary of the Treasury, and he suggested that the phrase, "God is our trust," be put on the coins. Coins back then were the main form of currency. Well, the Secretary of the Treasury liked the idea, so he tinkered with it a little bit, changed it to "In God we trust," and he started putting it on coins. So there you go. That dates from the time of the Civil War. Now, there are people on the religious right today who are convinced that, George Washington sat down personally and he designed the first penny with Abraham Lincoln's picture on it. And he put "In God we trust" on that, right? Well, that started at the time of the Civil War. It was not codified for use on paper currency until 1956. So, a fairly recent thing. About the same time they slipped under God with the Pledge of Allegiance. Now, the attempt to rewrite the preamble was proposed in 1864, voted on in 1874, reintroduced in 1882, Reintroduced, this is shocking, in 1961, 1963, and 1965. So as recently as the early 60s, this thing was still being introduced. Interestingly enough, when it was introduced in 1874, the House Judiciary Committee actually voted on it. This is as far as it ever went. They voted it down. They said, we are taking this step in full realization of the dangers which the union between church and state had imposed in so many nations in the old world. So even at that time, that post-Civil War period, people were reaching back to the argument that inspired Jefferson and Madison. Okay. Point 5. If all this stuff was happening in the late 19th century, Civil War, post-Civil War, doesn't that tell us something about the origin of this myth? Yes, it does. It tells us the real origin of the Christian nation myth is from that period. It's not from the founding period. It's not something that James Madison came up with. It's not something that Thomas Jefferson came up with. It's from this antebellum period. Civil War, post-Civil War. Why did it happen then? Well, scholars who have looked at this have argued that the post-Civil War was a very traumatic period for the country, obviously. Reconstruction, attempts to bring these states that had been in rebellion back into the nation. There was still a lot of resistance to this. People were unsure how to proceed. The president had been assassinated. His successor was a weak man, did not have a coherent vision for how to reunify the nation. When that happens, when you have that type of chaos, people are left grasping for answers. When people are left grasping for answers, some certain number of them will gravitate to religion and will demand that there be more religious expression in government and in public life. We have seen examples of that in our times as well. And that is really what brought this about. So the National Reform Association, seeing this chaos, this confusion, this wounded nation, took advantage of it to press its agenda. I mentioned the Christian Nation Amendment, Sunday laws. They also advocated for a generic form of Protestantism in the public school system, such as it was back then. It wasn't very extensive. But they were successful with that as well. Many of the schools would open their day with recitations of the Lord's Prayer or readings from the King James Version of the Bible, which of course is the Protestant version. So you had that. Also, they advocated for a broad program of censorship of anything that they saw as offensive to the Scriptures. In the 1880s, a gentleman who lived in San Francisco came to New York City and attempted to stage a dramatized version of the Passion of Christ on Broadway. And that he was shut down. New York City Council passed laws banning this because it was considered blasphemous and scandalous to present the life of Christ on the stage. Ministers had the power to do this sort of thing. And we see echoes of that into the modern era as well. So that's the story from the late 19th century. That's really the origin of the myth. That's really where it comes from. When people are advocating for this idea, the Christian nation, we were founded to be a Christian nation, what they're really reaching back to is not the founding period, but a period post-Civil War, which is probably the closest we ever came to officially or semi-officially or unofficially being a Christian nation. Many of the laws at that time did in fact reflect a sort of de facto version of generalized Protestantism. Some of the things they tried to do went too far, but many of the laws didn't, and it took a while for those to fade away or to be overturned by courts in more recent times. Where does that leave us? Well, the hold of the myth today. Why does something